In August 1917, Congress passed the Lever Food and Fuel Control Act. On its face, it was a law about grain, about bread, about feeding an army and an alliance through a European winter. One clause inside it prohibited the use of grain to make beverage alcohol for as long as the war lasted. In Louisville, Kentucky, that clause landed on a brick shop on East Main Street where men shaped sheet copper into stills, doublers, condensers, and beer heaters. The firm had filed its incorporation papers on the 1st of April, 1912. Its early order books record a business that had started well. Work for J.T.S. Brown & Sons, for E.H. Taylor Jr. & Sons, and for customers as far away as Mexico, Panama, and Burma. Grain goes into a mash tub. Alcohol comes out of copper. Remove the first, and the second becomes ornament. On the 17th of January, 1919, the 18th Amendment became law, to take effect 1 year later. The distilling customers of that Louisville shop did not decline gradually. They stopped. By 1923, the company had dropped out of the city directory, and its founder was building steam boilers in partnership with another man, in the same building, over the same floor. That is one shop, in one city, serving one industry. It is a useful place to start, because the men working the hammers on East Main Street belonged to a trade that had been present in American towns for 2 centuries, and had, at that point, roughly 40 years left in it. A coppersmith turned flat sheet into hollow shapes, not by casting it, not by bending it around a mold, but by striking it, thousands of times, in a spiral, over a shaped iron stake set into a block or held in a vise. Each blow moved a small amount of metal. Enough blows, placed correctly, walked a flat disc up into the walls of a kettle. The trade name for the technique is raising, and it is far older than the country it was practiced in. A version of it was in use in the 3rd millennium before Christ. The metal resists. Copper comes off the mill soft, and every hammer blow makes it harder. Keep working it and the grain structure inside the sheet distorts. The metal loses its willingness to stretch, and it begins to split at the rim. The only way through is heat. Bring the sheet up to temperature. Hold it there, and the internal structure reforms into new, unstressed grains. The metal goes soft again, and the work continues. A single vessel could go back into the fire many times before it held the shape the smith wanted. There were no thermometers in that fire. The signal is a dull red glow across the surface of the metal, and it is a faint color. Bright daylight washes it out completely. The judgment was made by eye, by a man who had been watching copper change color since he was a boy. Read it wrong in one direction, and the sheet stays half hard and cracks under the next pass. Read it wrong in the other, and the grain grows coarse, and the metal is weakened permanently. That was the everyday skill. Not a specialism, not an art, the baseline competence required to make a coffee pot. And the country was full of work for it. Copper carried heat faster and more evenly than iron. It did not rust. It could be worked cold, joined by brazing or riveting, dented, straightened, patched, and put back into service. In an American town in 1880, that combination made the coppersmith one of the men you could not do without. He made and mended the wash boiler, the kettle, the milk pan, the still, the brewery vessel, and a good deal of what the local mill and dairy ran on. By the 1950s, the men who could still do that work were being described inside their own industry as a rapidly disappearing group of highly skilled craftsmen. Between those 2 sentences sits the question, worth an hour of anyone's attention. This was not a decorative trade or a marginal one. The skill took years to acquire, the material was essential, and the demand was real. So what removed it? The answer offered most often, that machines simply did it faster, is true, and it is also incomplete. It leaves out the year the government took the grain away. It leaves out the arrival of a wider, cheaper, more uniform sheet from the mills of Connecticut, which helped the hand shops before it helped the factories that beat them. It leaves out a change in the way metal was joined, which made an entire category of skill unnecessary inside about 20 years. And it leaves out a decision taken in the 1950s about a completely different metal. 4 pressures, arriving in a particular order. Consider what that order meant for one man. A boy apprenticed to a coppersmith in the 1890s spent years learning to read heat, to control a hammer, and to close a seam that would hold liquid under pressure. He had every reason to expect that skill to carry him to the end of his working life, as it had carried the man who taught him. It did not. The trade he entered as a child was substantially gone before he reached 60. The material comes first. Before the process, before the shop, before the money, where the copper came from, what it cost, and what form it arrived in. Copper is one of the very few metals a human being can shape into a watertight vessel without ever melting it. That single property sits underneath everything else in this trade. Gold and silver share it, and were priced accordingly. Iron does not. Iron is worked hot, at the forge, by a blacksmith with a different set of tools and a different relationship to the fire. Copper can be raised cold, softened when it refuses to move, and finished by one man working alone at a bench. To that, copper adds a second property that made it valuable rather than merely workable. It moves heat quickly and spreads it evenly. A copper kettle over a fire does not develop the fierce hot spot directly above the flame that scorches whatever is sitting on the bottom of a thin iron pot. For anything that had to be boiled slowly and stirred for hours, apple butter, soap, sugar syrup, laundry, mash, that difference was not a refinement. It decided whether the batch came out usable. And copper does not rust. Iron in a damp dairy or a wet laundry begins to fail immediately. Copper corrodes slowly, and the surface it forms tends to protect the metal underneath, rather than flaking away and exposing fresh material to attack. There was one significant problem, and the trade had solved it long before this period. Copper reacts with acidic food. Left bare, a copper pan will put copper into anything sharp enough to attack it. Tomatoes, vinegar, fruit. The answer was a thin internal lining of tin, wiped onto the clean inner surface, while the vessel was hot. That lining wore out. It had to be replaced. Retinning became a steady, unglamorous, recurring source of income for shops across the country, and it says something important about the economy this trade lived inside. The vessel was expected to come back. That expectation shaped the whole business. A copper kettle was not a purchase. It was an asset. It was dented and hammered straight. It was cracked and brazed. It was worn through at the bottom and given a new bottom, and when it finally could not be repaired, it was still not thrown away, because scrap copper held cash value and went back into the supply as raw material. For most of his week, the coppersmith was a repairman. The customer list in a town of a few thousand people was wider than modern eyes expect. Households needed wash boilers and kettles. Farms needed evaporating pans and dairy vessels. Breweries and distilleries needed stills, worms, condensers, and heaters. Confectioners needed kettles that would not scorch sugar. Roofers wanted copper flashing in gutters because they outlasted everything else on the building. Ship chandlers, fire companies, druggists, hatters, and tanners all ran copper equipment, and all of it eventually needed a man with a stake and a hammer. Now the supply. For most of the colonial period, American coppersmiths worked under a constraint that had nothing to do with skill. Copper was mined in the colonies, but it was shipped to England to be smelted and rolled, then shipped back, and it came back in small pieces. A smith who wanted to make anything larger than a modest pot had to braze or rivet several sheets together before he could begin. That account rests on a single detailed source rather than several independent ones, so the specifics deserve caution. The broader picture of scarce, small format, imported sheet in early American shops is consistent across the material. The American brass and copper mill industry began early in the life of the Republic, and it concentrated in one place. The Naugatuck Valley in Connecticut, along a 40-mile stretch running from Torrington through Waterbury and south to Ansonia and Derby. The early mills there made brass buttons and copper vessels, and over time they worked out the melting and rolling methods the rest of the industry would go on to use. Then the supply side changed scale altogether. Around the turn of the 20th century, efficient flotation processes made it economic to work the enormous low-grade porphyry deposits of Arizona, Montana, and Utah by open-pit methods. The United States became the largest copper producer in the world. For the small shop, this was good news. At first, sheet became cheaper, wider, flatter, and far more consistent in thickness than anything a colonial smith could have obtained. A man could buy a disc already close to the right diameter and the right gauge and start raising immediately, instead of losing a day joining stock together. It is worth holding on to that, because the same industrial supply chain that was making the hand shop more productive was simultaneously making something else possible. Wide, uniform, dependable sheet is precisely what a press needs. It is precisely what a spinning lathe needs. The mills of the Naugatuck Valley were not neutral in what came next. They armed both sides of a fight that had not started yet. One shop's records show the direction of travel remarkably early. A Philadelphia family of coppersmiths, active in the trade from about 1813 to 1878, began as general metalsmiths, dealing mostly with private individuals. By the middle of the 1840s, they were producing copper goods primarily for manufacturers and tradesmen. They kept the small staff. They kept the hand method. What changed was who they were working for. The man at the bench was already becoming a supplier to industry, rather than a supplier to a town. The coppersmith did not make his own metal. He bought it. That sounds like a small point, and it is not. It sets the outer boundary of everything he could do. By the second half of the 19th century, the American smith stood at the end of a long industrial chain: mine, smelter, refinery, rolling mill, and the sheet that arrived at his door had already had most of its important decisions made for it by other men. Its purity, its thickness, its width, its hardness. He worked inside those decisions, and when they changed, his trade changed with them. Begin with thickness, because thickness decides the job. Sheet copper is bought by gauge: a coffee pot body, a milk pan, a light kettle, thin stock, cut with hand shears, raised quickly, and easily dented in a customer's kitchen. A still is a different problem entirely. It sits over direct fire. It holds a hot charge. It is knocked about by men working around it, and it is expected to earn its purchase price back over years. It has to be built out of substantially heavier metal. The scale of that difference has not changed much. The firm in Louisville that has been building stills by hand since the early 1900s still works in copper from roughly 1/8 of an inch up to 3/16, going heavier, 1/4 inch, sometimes 3/8, for certain pot stills. That is plate, not sheet. It behaves like a different material. And heavier stock punishes the man holding the hammer. The relationship between thickness and labor is not a straight line. Thicker metal absorbs more of each blow without moving, so it takes more force and more strikes to shift the same amount of copper. It work hardens through a greater depth, so it needs softening more often. Every extra thousandth of an inch buys strength at the shop's expense. Then there is temper, which surprises people. Copper does not arrive soft. Rolling is itself cold work, and the sheet comes off the mill already hardened by the process that flattened it. Before a smith could begin shaping, he frequently had to take a new sheet and anneal it, heat it, soften it, undo the mill's work, simply to get back to a state he could hammer. Then width, which is the oldest constraint in this trade and the most persistent. Early American shops, working with small imported plates, had to join stock before they could form anything substantial. That constraint eased enormously as domestic mills matured, but it never entirely disappeared. The Louisville firm reports that domestic sources cannot supply anything wider than a 36-inch sheet, which is why heavier and wider plate has to be brought in from Europe, with a wait of 20 to 26 weeks. A shop building large vessels therefore carries a substantial copper inventory of its own, because the alternative is telling a customer to come back in 6 months. Width has always dictated design. Where the metal ran out, a seam had to go, and the seam then had to be strong enough to be forgotten about. Now the price, which is where the trade's economics start. Copper's value moved a great deal across this period. Using the long United States government series of estimated unit values, the metal was worth in the region of 16 cents a pound around 1900, climbed to roughly 29 cents at the wartime peak in 1917, and then fell hard, reaching its lowest point of the whole era in the early 1930s at somewhere near 6 cents. Those are approximate figures, derived from a consumption-based series rather than a shop's invoice, and other price records disagree on the exact numbers in individual years, so treat them as the shape of the thing rather than the thing itself. The shape is what matters. Material cost was not a rounding error in this business. It was a live variable that could double, and it explains a set of habits that otherwise look like thrift for its own sake. It explains why the offcuts went into a barrel rather than the stove. It explains why a worn-out vessel was weighed rather than discarded, and why the scrap dealer's wagon was a regular caller. It explains why a farmer would put a cracked kettle in the back of a cart and drive it into town instead of buying a new one, and why the smith was glad of the work. In a trade where the raw material had real cash value at every stage of its life, including after death, repair was not sentiment. It was arithmetic. Alongside the copper itself, a shop consumed a short list of other materials: hard solder for brazing, a copper and zinc alloy, supplied as granules or rods, used for joints that had to survive mechanical stress. Flux to keep the joint clean while the heat went in. Tin for lining. Acid for the pickle bath that stripped oxide off heated metal. Charcoal or coke for the hearth. None of it glamorous. All of it necessary, and all of it bought, carried, stored, and paid for by a man who was usually also the one swinging the hammer. The material has arrived at the bench now. A flat disc of soft copper, a known thickness, a known diameter, sitting on a plank in a shop somewhere in Pennsylvania or Ohio or Kentucky in about 1890. Everything that happens next is done by hand. The first act is layout, and it is done with a pair of dividers. The smith sets the points to the radius he needs, plants one leg at the center of the sheet, and scribes a circle. That circle is the entire vessel. Every square inch of the finished kettle, base, walls, rim, has to come out of it, because nothing will be added later. Getting the diameter wrong at this stage is not a small error. It is the whole job. The disc is cut out with heavy bench shears, or, in a better equipped shop, on a circle cutter. Then the real work starts, and there are two ways into it. The first is sinking. The disc is laid over a dished hollow, cut into an end-grain wooden block, and struck from above, so the metal is driven down into the depression. It is fast, it is easy to learn, and it thins the base of the vessel, because sinking stretches the metal it is working on. The second is raising, and it does the opposite. The disc is held at an angle against a shaped iron stake, and the smith strikes just above the point where the metal touches the stake. That blow does not stretch the copper, it compresses it, folding a small amount of the wall inward and upward. He rotates the piece a fraction, and strikes again, and again. A complete circuit is called a course, and a course lifts the wall by a small amount all the way around. Then he moves up and does it again, and again. A vessel of any size takes course after course after course, and the sequence is the same every time, a spiral of overlapping blows, walking the flat metal up into a wall. There was a third approach, used for some curved forms, in which the sheet was deliberately gathered into wrinkles, and the wrinkles then hammered flat, which pulled the surface into a curve. Different route, same principle. Move the metal without removing any of it. Somewhere inside those courses, the copper stops cooperating. This is the annealing cycle described earlier, and in practice it dominates the working day. The piece is heated until the surface carries a dull, even red, then cooled. Heating it in open fire leaves a layer of dark oxide across the surface, and that oxide is a real problem. It will get hammered into the metal on the next pass, and it will ruin any attempt to braze or solder that surface later. So the piece goes into a pickle, a weak acid bath that strips the scale and leaves clean copper. Heat, cool, pickle, scour, back to the stake. Raise, anneal, pickle, raise, anneal, pickle. The number of repetitions is set by the metal, not by the schedule, and the process was recognized at the time, and since, as extraordinarily labor-intensive. That phrase is doing real work. It is the reason hand-raising eventually lost. As the walls come up, the smith is checking constantly, against a wooden template cut to the profile he wants, against the last piece of the same pattern, against his own eye. Raising is not self-correcting. An error introduced in the third course is still there in the 12th, and larger. One physical consequence is worth knowing, because it is how these objects are identified today. In hand-raising, the smith is pushing the copper outward and upward over the stake, and the walls therefore tend to thin slightly as they approach the rim. Machine-formed pieces frequently do the reverse. When the shape is right, the surface is still covered in the coarse texture of raising. The last forming operation removes it. Planishing uses a polished hammer against a polished stake, and each light blow flattens a small area of the wall between the two smooth faces. The result is a surface of fine, even facets, and it does something more useful than look good. Planishing is cold work, so it deliberately hardens the finished vessel. A properly planished copper pot is stiffer than the soft sheet it came from. The final act of shaping is also the act that gives the object its strength. That texture is the signature. Hammer marks across the inside floor, and the inner walls of a vessel are the mark of hand-raising, because no other forming or joining method requires the interior of the piece to be hammered at all. For anything too large to come out of one sheet, seams had to be made, and the coppersmith's answer was the dovetail. The edges of two sheets were cut into a row of interlocking tabs, pushed together, hammered down tight, and then brazed with copper zinc hard solder, producing a joint stronger and stiffer than the metal on either side of it. It is slow, and it is highly skilled. In the later 19th century, tooling appeared that could cut a regular castellated edge mechanically, which made the joint faster and cheaper, and the serrations became finer and more even than a man could cut by hand. Copper resisted welding longer than most metals. Reliable welding of copper was not achieved until around the beginning of the 20th century. Before then, brazing and riveting were the only serious options. Bottoms were often let in separately, in heavier stock, since the base takes the fire and the wear. And when everything was assembled, the interior was tinned, and the object went out to a customer who expected to see it again. Hold that sequence in your head. Lay out, cut, sink, or raise, anneal, pickle, repeat, true, planish, seam, braze, bottom, tin. 12 operations, 1 man, no motor. Now put a fire under it, and fill it with alcohol vapor. Copper is the only material in this story that gets used up on purpose. Everything discussed so far treats the metal as passive. It holds shape, it moves heat, it resists rust. Inside a still, copper stops being a container and becomes a participant. It reacts. It is consumed. And that single fact built the largest and steadiest market the American coppersmith ever had. Start with how the industry arrived at copper, because the usual telling gets the order wrong. Distillers did not choose copper because they understood the chemistry. Archaeological evidence puts copper stills in use as far back as the 9th century, and by the time whiskey distilling spread across Europe and into the New World, copper was already the standard. What the trade knew was empirical, and it was arrived at the way most craft knowledge is arrived at. Spirit made in copper came out cleaner, smoother, and more desirable than spirit made in iron, clay, or brass. Nobody could say why. Everybody could taste it. The explanation came much later, and it is worth stating properly. Fermentation produces sulphur compounds. They derive from the amino acids methionine and cysteine, which come in turn from the yeast and the grain. Hydrogen sulfide, dimethyl sulfide, mercaptans, and, most significantly, dimethyl trisulfide. Left in the spirit, these give notes of rotten eggs, boiled cabbage, and burnt rubber. Copper takes them out. It binds the volatile sulfur compounds, forming copper sulfide, that adheres to the inside surfaces of the still and comes out at cleaning rather than going out with the liquid. There is a further detail that matters to anyone running the equipment. It is clean copper that does the work. Copper salts produced by corrosion of the inner surfaces actually encourage the formation of dimethyl trisulfide from methionine, while uncorroded copper reduces it. Deposits building up inside the condenser worm cut the metal's reactivity further. A dirty still works against its own purpose. So the vessel has to be cleaned, and cleaning removes metal, and the reaction itself removes metal. Copper in a still is sacrificial, according to the Louisville firm's own account, a single source, so take the figure as indicative. A copper still might have to be replaced roughly every 7 years. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the commercial heart of this trade. The coppersmith who supplied a distillery was not making a one-time sale. He was selling a component with a service life to a customer who would be back in an industry that was expanding. That is a business with a floor under it. There is also the plain matter of heat. A pot still sits over direct fire, and copper spreads that heat evenly through the charge, instead of concentrating it where the flame touches. And a still is not one object. The 1914 trade press description of a complete miniature distillery built by the Louisville shop lists what a plant actually needed: the weighing of the grain, a hopper, the mash tub, the fermenters, the copper still, the copper doubler, a beer heater, the rakes and coils, the flake stand, tall boxes for the low wines and the whiskey, and the slop tubs. Every part of the operation could be followed, and each part was built in the same materials as a full-sized plant: wood, steel, and copper. The whole thing occupied a space of 5 feet by 6. It was shown at the New Willard Hotel in Washington during the National Wholesale Liquor Dealers Association convention, and the following year an improved version was exhibited at the Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco, where it took a bronze medal and a diploma. The trade press noted, almost as an aside, that while the miniature was being built, the same shop was also producing all the stills and apparatus for a 1,000-bushel plant going up in Alabama. now the size of the field, which is smaller than most people expect. The Cincinnati firm that trained the Louisville founder could boast of more than 80 distillery customers in its printed catalog. And in 1911, when the Louisville shop placed its first advertisement in the Wine and Spirit Bulletin, one of the leading distilling trade publications of the day, 6 coppersmiths in various American cities advertised in that publication. 6. That was the visible competitive field, supplying the equipment for an entire national industry. One more feature of this market deserves attention, because it becomes decisive later. Distilling was a supervised industry. The company still holds a United States government stamp bearing its name, for a still fabricated in October 1910. The National Association of Storekeepers, Gaugers and Storekeeper Gaugers, the government men who oversaw the running of the nation's distilleries, held its annual convention in Louisville in 1911, and the shop advertised in its program. Every legal still in the country was known to the federal government. That was normal, and it was untroubling, and it was about to matter enormously. The same equipment had other uses. A significant amount of the shop's early work went to wood products companies, making creosote and turpentine, both obtained by distillation. Sugar refiners, confectioners, and chemical works all needed the same skills. But the anchor customer, the one that paid for the building and the payroll and the inventory, was whiskey. Whiskey existed at the pleasure of the law, so what did the work pay? This is the point where most accounts of a vanished trade become vague and sentimental, and there is no need for that here, because the federal government counted these men. The Bureau of Labor Statistics published a recurring survey called the Union Scale of Wages and Hours of Labor. By the 1918 edition, it was the 7th in the series, and it covered the scales of 826,638 union members in the principal trades of 58 industrial cities across 36 states. Coppersmiths appear in it by name, grouped under metal trades alongside blacksmiths, boilermakers, machinists, molders, core makers, and pattern makers. That grouping is itself informative. Officially, the coppersmith was a metal tradesman like any other. Then look at what happened to him in the 1 year when metalwork should have been the best paid labor in America. Between May 1917 and May 1918, with the country at war and every machine shop in the nation running on military orders, all of the metal trades gained. The Bureau's summary gives the range plainly. Increases running from 21% for coppersmiths to 41% for blacksmiths' helpers. As a group, the metal trades gained 30% on weekly rates, and the Bureau attributed that to the enormous increase in machine shop work, on war orders and otherwise, which had produced a sharp demand for machinists and other metal workers. Coppersmiths came last, not close to last. Last, by a distance, behind even the helpers of other trades. The Bureau does not explain why, and neither will this account beyond noting the obvious shape of it, that a war fought with shells, ships, boilers, and machined parts had less use for a man who could raise a vessel by hand than it had for almost anyone else in the same building. That is inference drawn from the pattern, not a documented finding. The hours are recorded too. A union scale, as the Bureau defined it, fixes a limit in only one direction. It sets a minimum wage and a maximum number of hours for a regular day. Across the cities surveyed, metal trades weeks of 54 hours were still common early in the century, falling toward 48, and then, in some trades and places, 44. By 1918, regular hours had come down slightly again on the previous year. Wage rates alone tell you very little, so put them against prices. Taking 1913 as a base of 100, hourly union wage rates across all trades stood at 133 by 1918. Retail food prices, measured over the same period by the same Bureau, stood at 168. Wages up by a third, food up by 2/3. The Bureau ran the arithmetic itself and published an index of the purchasing power of union wages measured in food. On hourly rates, it had fallen to about 79. A working man in 1918 could buy roughly a fifth less food with an hour of his labor than he could 5 years earlier, and that was true whether he was a coppersmith or a bricklayer. There is a complication in these figures worth flagging. The metal trades worked to a considerable extent on piece rates, and the Bureau declined to publish them, noting the rates were too numerous and the units of payment too variable to quote, while adding that earnings at piece rates usually exceeded full-time earnings at the time rates of the trade. So the fast man made more. Payment by the piece rewards speed above everything else. Hold that thought. It is precisely the logic a machine is built to win. And there is one figure that is simply not in these tables at all. The Bureau did not publish scales for apprentices. Where it found that the work of helpers was largely being done by apprentices, it omitted those helper scales entirely, rather than mislabel them. The boy in the corner of the shop, fetching, sweeping, working the fire and learning the trade, is a hole in the national record by design. An honest admission belongs here. In preparing this account, it was not possible to extract a specific city and year rate in cents per hour for coppersmiths from the Bureau's general tables. Those figures exist. They sit in the detailed city-by-city tables of the Union Scale Bulletins, and anyone with the patience to work through them can find what a coppersmith in Cincinnati or St. Louis was owed in a given May. What is offered here is the shape of the trade's position, not a precise pay packet. All of that describes the city shop, the organized shop, the shop with a scale. The small-town coppersmith lived in a different economy entirely. He was usually a proprietor rather than a wage earner. His income came in small pieces from many directions: a repair, a retinning, a new wash boiler, a job of roofing flashing, a kettle bottomed for a farmer. He set his own hours because there was nobody to set them for him, and his earnings tracked, almost exactly, the number of hours his hands could deliver. That was the arrangement for a very long time, and it was survivable. It stopped being survivable when the number of hours stopped being the limiting factor. The machine did not beat the coppersmith at hammering. Nothing has ever beaten a good coppersmith at hammering. What the machines did was change the definition of the job so completely that hammering stopped being the point. There were 3 of them, and they arrived in sequence. The first was the spinning lathe. The principle takes a sentence to describe. A flat metal disc is mounted on a lathe against a shaped chuck of wood or metal, and while the whole assembly turns, the operator presses the disc onto the chuck with a long burnishing tool until the metal takes the chuck's form. The technique was developed in the 19th century, and it works on most metals. Like raising, it hardens the metal as it goes, so the piece is periodically annealed, exactly as it would be at the bench. Notice what has and has not changed. The metal still has to be softened. The operator still has to read the material. But the spiral of 10,000 separate hammer blows has been replaced by continuous rotation and steady pressure, and the shape now lives in the chuck, rather than in one man's judgment. Here is the part usually left out of the story. Spinning did not de-skill the work. A spinner needs hand-eye coordination, developed over a long period, and the trade carries a famously steep learning curve, which is why it was traditionally associated with low-volume production, rather than mass output. The first machine to threaten the coppersmith replaced his skill with a different skill, not with an unskilled man. Power made the difference. Hand spinning advanced significantly with the arrival of water and steam power in Europe and North America during the 19th century, and by the early 20th century, the electric motor supplied the speed the process really wanted. Between the late 19th and the mid-20th centuries, individual electric motors at each machine replaced the line shafting that had run entire shops from one engine. The second machine was the press, stamping from sheet or strip for small components in quantity. Deep drawing, which uses a punch and die to force a flat blank into a deep cupped form in a single operation. This is where deskilling actually happens. A drawn cup does not require judgment. It requires a die, a press, and a man to feed it. And the press did something more damaging than simply making pots quickly. From the 1880s, the wider adoption of presses and lathes for thicker pans meant that many items which had previously required joining could now be made in one piece, with no seam at all. Understand what that removes. The dovetailed seam was the coppersmith's highest and least replaceable skill. The row of interlocking tabs, cut, meshed, hammered flat and brazed into a joint stronger than the sheet on either side of it. Take away the need for a seam and you have not merely saved labor. You have deleted the operation that separated a trained man from an untrained one. Between about 1890 and the 1920s, smiths went on dovetailing large or awkwardly shaped pieces, because presses have size limits, but the ordinary work had gone. The third machine finished it, and it was not a machine for shaping metal at all. Welding was understood as a scientific idea in the 19th century, but it was not practical on a shop floor until around 1900, when the handheld acetylene torch made it usable. Copper held out longer than most metals. The technique was not applied to copper with reliable results until the beginning of the 20th century. Once it worked, the consequences came quickly. Welding is faster than dovetailing. It produces a more durable joint. And, this is the sentence that matters, it requires less technical expertise. Commercial coppersmiths began shifting to welded joins after about 1900. By the 1920s, dovetailing new work had become uncommon. No commercially produced dovetailed pieces are known after the Second World War. Roughly 25 years to retire a skill that took a man years to acquire. The materials moved as well. In Britain, where this part of the trade is better documented, mass production and the arrival of alternative materials, aluminium, and later stainless steel, are identified as the forces that reduced traditional copper craftsmanship through the 20th century. The typical spun object of the modern era is the aluminium saucepan. Light, cheap, and needing no tin lining at all. Now set this against the wage structure described earlier. The metal trades work substantially on piece rates, and piece rates reward speed above every other quality. A trade that had already agreed to be paid by output had, in effect, already agreed to be judged on the one measure where it could not win. Something did survive, and it is worth being precise about what. Repair survived, because no machine can undent a kettle. Large vessels survived, because presses have a maximum size. Oddly shaped and one-off work survived. Heavy plate work survived, which is why a still is still built by hand today. The exceptional work stayed. The ordinary work left. And no small-town shop in America ever lived on exceptional work. The machines took the household trade. The law took what was left, and it took it inside a single decade, and it can be dated almost to the week. August 1917, the Lever Food and Fuel Control Act. Grain may not be used to make beverage alcohol while the war lasts, framed as temporary. December 1917, Congress votes to submit the 18th Amendment to the states for ratification. The 17th of January, 1919, the amendment becomes law. As specified in its own text, it takes effect 1 year after that. From 1917 until the 21st Amendment repealed Prohibition in 1933. With very few exceptions, the distilleries and breweries of the United States were not able to use their distilling equipment to produce beverage alcohol. Read that line as a coppersmith. It is not a downturn. It is not reduced orders. It is the entire customer base, all at once, for 16 years. Some of the equipment stayed technically alive. Beginning in 1922, about 30 distilleries and warehouses, many of them in Kentucky, were designated as concentration warehouse sites, where aging whiskey from shuttered distilleries across the country was gathered together to keep it secure. Those sites were permitted to bottle whiskey on the premises for medicinal purposes. Bottling is not distilling. Bottling does not need a coppersmith. Now follow one firm through it, because for once the record is close to complete. The Louisville shop's customer base in the distilling industry almost totally collapsed. There was a trickle of work fabricating equipment for wood products companies and industrial alcohol plants. After 1923, the company was no longer listed in the city directory at all. Its founder, then in his mid-40s, had been learning and running this trade since 1901. He went into partnership with a man named Gus Kleinstuber, manufacturing steam boilers, operating out of the same shop on East Main Street. In 1925, he was hired to dismantle a shuttered distillery in Henderson, Kentucky, and re-erect it in Vancouver, British Columbia. He moved there with his family for 6 months. The plant was going somewhere, the law still allowed it to run. In 1926 or 1927, he and several family members set up the Southern Gasoline Pump Works to manufacture pumps. It was short-lived. By 1931, the city directory lists him as working as a bookkeeper for the Nugent Sand Company. Bookkeeper is where he began, 30 years earlier. Trained, promoted, founded his own firm, supplied a national industry, exhibited a working miniature distillery at a World's Fair, and took a medal for it, and finished the sequence back at the same job title, at a sand company. He was still buying, though. In May 1927, he purchased a property on North Shelby Street, and it was from there that the business would eventually be re-established. Meanwhile, the American demand for copper stills did not fall. It went up. The number of liquor-producing stills seized nationally rose from 32,000 in 1920 to 261,000 in 1928. In West Virginia alone, 683 stills were seized during 1923 and 1924, the 14th highest total in the country. 261,000 seized in a single year. Seizure meant destruction. So consider the position. The United States was building and running more stills than at any point in its history, and destroying them on an industrial scale, while the men who built the best stills in the country had nothing to do. The reason sits in a detail from earlier. Every legal still was known to the federal government. The Louisville firm still holds a government stamp for a still it made in October 1910, and the government's own storekeepers and gaugers held their convention in that city in 1911. Registration was ordinary and unremarkable while the industry was legal. It also made a registered fabricator structurally incapable of serving an illegal market. The underground trade supplied itself. Smaller, cruder, sometimes dangerous equipment, built from whatever sheet could be found. That last point is inference about the mechanism, rather than a documented statement, but it follows from the recorded facts on both sides. Enforcement was thin from the beginning. Preparing for the Volstead Act, the Internal Revenue Service, which already had 2,283 agents, was to receive only 800 new ones for the entire country. Later, the Bureau of Prohibition had 1,786 agents, investigators and special agents nationally, and a federal commission recommended raising that figure to at least 3,000. In the southern Appalachians, where distilling long predated Prohibition, better roads and faster cars meant illegal liquor flowed out of the Smoky Mountains to cities across the nation through the 1920s and 1930s. The bottom arrived in the early 1930s. So did the turn. From late 1929, as the supplies of aging whiskey available for medicinal use began to run low, the government permitted a handful of distilleries to produce limited amounts of new whiskey. In 1932, the Louisville firm was commissioned to fabricate a 3,000-bushel, 24-hour complete distillery for the Joseph S. Finch Distillery at Shenley, Pennsylvania, one of the very few holding a production permit. The bookkeeper at the Sand Company in 1931 was building an entire distillery in 1932. And through 1933, the records show major work for about a dozen Kentucky distilleries, rushing to revamp abandoned plants in anticipation of the end of Prohibition. They knew what was coming. Prohibition officially ended on the 5th of December, 1933, when the 21st Amendment was ratified by the necessary 36th state. What followed was the largest boom this trade ever saw, and then the beginning of its end, in that order. More than 126 distilleries opened between 1934 and 1937. The Louisville firm eventually did business with over 100 different distilleries across the country. The range of the orders tells you what a recovering industry actually buys. At one end, an entire 9,000-bushel 24-hour distillery and massive 96-inch beer stills with all their associated equipment. At the other, individual yeast jugs, fermenter coils, and copper tanks. Most of the work was for Kentucky, but orders came from as far away as California, Massachusetts, and Puerto Rico. Then, in January 1937, in the middle of one of the busiest seasons the shop had ever had, the Ohio River flooded and put much of Louisville underwater. The shop stood on low ground near the river. The water reached the rafters. They rebuilt, and 5 years later the federal government took beverage alcohol away for the second time in 25 years. By 1942, because of the critical need for 190-proof industrial alcohol, for synthetic rubber, for ammunition, for other war material, all distilleries were prohibited from producing beverage alcohol. Where they could, they turned out enormous quantities of ethyl alcohol for wartime use instead. The equipment suppliers adjusted their product lines and carried on. That is twice, 2 separate periods, inside one working lifetime, in which an entire industry's output was redirected by statute, and the men who built its equipment simply had to find something else to make. Now the fourth pressure, and it is the quietest of the four. Beginning in the 1950s, stainless steel started to gain popularity as a fabrication material, valued for its remarkable longevity. Set that beside the figure from earlier. A copper still might have to be replaced roughly every 7 years. A stainless steel still is almost indestructible. Read that as a business rather than as an engineering preference, and the consequence is immediate. The copper still's commercial logic was that it wore out. That was never a defect. It was the recurring revenue that kept skilled coppersmiths employed between the large contracts, and it had survived the presses, the spinning lathes, the acetylene torch, and 2 federal prohibitions. Stainless steel removed it. Shop workers were trained to handle the new material while still retaining their expertise as coppersmiths, described, in the industry's own words at that moment, as a rapidly disappearing group of highly skilled craftsmen. So here is the answer to the question this began with. The American coppersmith was not beaten by a better hammer. He was removed by 4 pressures, arriving in a particular order. The press and the spinning lathe took his ordinary work, and by making bodies without seams, they deleted the joint that proved he was trained. Welding, faster, more durable, and requiring less technical expertise, retired the dovetail inside about 25 years. Federal law twice removed the one customer whose equipment still had to be built by hand, and stainless steel finally removed the wear that had guaranteed him a return visit. Every one of those is a story about demand, not about skill. Nobody ever got better at raising copper than the men who lost. And the craft did not die, it narrowed. Copper's chemistry never became optional. The metal still binds the sulphur compounds, and whiskey stills are still built by hand, in heavy plate, in the same city, by the fourth generation of the same family. The skill contracted to the jobs where nothing else will do. There is one detail that closes this properly. In the 1990s, the coppersmiths of that Louisville shop were commissioned to fabricate replicas of 18th century pot stills for George Washington's reconstructed distillery at Mount Vernon. The trade that industrial America spent a century making unnecessary turned out to be the only trade that could rebuild what industrial America had replaced. If you want to know whether something in your own house came out of that world, turn it over and look inside. Not at the outside, which anyone can polish. Look at the inside floor and the inner walls. Hammer marks there, hundreds of small overlapping facets, mean a man raised it, because no machine process requires the interior of a vessel to be struck at all. One request before the end: if you have a copper vessel in the family, and you find that texture inside it, describe it in the comments. The shape, roughly how old you believe it to be, and whether there is a dovetailed seam running up the outer wall. Between us, that comment section will probably hold a better record of surviving American hand-raised work than any single archive does. The tools outlasted the trade. Stakes are still sitting in barns. Hammers still turn up in old tool chests, their handles worn into the shape of one particular hand. Somebody spent years learning to read the color of hot metal in a darkened room. That knowledge had nowhere left to go.